So in my right hand, I'm holding my cell phone from 1995. This was my very first cell phone, and my parents bought it for me, and they said, Susan, you're going to only use this cell phone in an emergency. And in my left hand, I'm holding my iPhone 6S. And we all know that I can do much more with this phone than just make emergency calls, right? I can compute, I can record video, I can listen to the radio. And in the 90s, if I wanted to do those things, I would have needed to drive my Dodge Omni to the Radio Shack and buy all of these devices, the computer and the big video recorder and the radio, so I could listen to Hootie and the Blowfish. And this is even true right down to the fine print on this ad, where I would have needed a phone book. Do you remember phone books? To find the Radio Shack store nearest me. So in this 30-year period, we've collapsed and miniaturized all of these devices onto this single handheld device. But if you compare these devices in this 30-year time span, they're not actually that different in size. And so the thing that has happened is that we've miniaturized the components that have gone into this device. And the key device that we have miniaturized is called the transistor. So a transistor is a switch, and this is a photo of the very original transistor as it was invented around this time of the year in 1947 at Bell Labs. And the active part of the transistor, the part that does the switching, is very small. It's only about the diameter of a hair on your head. But the transistor that you use in your cell phones today is over here, and that's 5,000 times smaller. So to put that into perspective, if the original transistor were the length of a football field, the one that you use today would be the diameter of a dime. Last year, Intel announced that they can pack over 100 million of these things into a square millimeter. So that's like if every person were a transistor and we packed tightly into a crowd, that crowd would occupy 14 square miles. That's 1/4 of the area of DC. We've all benefited from this extreme scaling of these devices over this past 70 years. But the era of that miniaturization is over. And let me explain why. I told you that the transistor is a switch. So we have to control its off and its on state. And this is how we do it. We control where electrons can and can't go. So when the device is off, we present the electron with an energy barrier. And so when the electron tries to move around, it just can't get through the energy barrier. But if we want to turn the switch on, what we do is we lower the barrier, and then the electrons can flow freely. When we turn this off and on, this is how we do computation. But if you scale the transistor smaller and smaller and smaller until now we're counting the size of it with the number of atoms in that size, these electrons behave very, very differently. They behave more like you might expect a ghost to behave when it's presented with a wall. And so in this case, the ghost just passes right through the wall, doesn't even see it. And so this device is always on, and we don't have a switch. Now you're sitting there thinking, I came to an awards ceremony for the chemical sciences, so why is she standing up here talking about electrical engineering topics and device physics? And I promise you that I'm trained as a chemical scientist. So my PhD is in chemical engineering, and what I studied was how ions move around, particularly in polymer materials. And the way I got into electrical engineering was on a dare. I followed my husband to the University of Notre Dame, and he was earning his PhD there, and there happened to be these research faculty positions that opened up in electrical engineering. He said, you should apply. And I said, that's ridiculous. I've never even taken an electrical engineering class in my life. They will never hire me. And then they offered me the job at the end of the interview. And so there I was in a completely different field, in a field I didn't even understand the language. And in fact, one of my mentors back at Penn State told me that this would be, quote, career suicide. So I was very nervous. But I started talking with the wonderful electrical engineers there, and they started learning about my work, and I started learning about theirs, and we realized that there's this way of using ions, the thing that I had studied, to control where these electrons can and can't go. And if we could control where these electrons can and can't go, then we could scale these devices smaller and smaller. We could control those ghosts. And I knew from the women who had came before me that if there's anything we can do, we can capture and control ghosts. So there I am. And so in chemical sciences, ions are our friends. We're familiar with them. We use them in a bunch of different technologies, a bunch of different devices. The one that you're probably most familiar with is a lithium-ion battery. That's the device that powers these things that we love so much, right? And ions are involved in the electrical signaling that happens in your cells and in your body. So we love them. In fact, we think that ions make everything better. But that's not true in the semiconductor device community. In fact, if you look into the clean rooms where these transistors are packed into these teeny tiny areas, those folks who may have even come into contact with ions are forced to wear different colored clean room suits to indicate their potential contamination. But ironically, this also illustrates the fact that if ions get into these transistors, they can really strongly affect their properties. So if we can control where the ions go, then we can control where those electrons go. And about this time that we were toying with this idea of ions, I realized that those folks in the semiconductor device community, because they were trying to address this issue of making everything smaller and smaller and smaller, they started looking into these two-dimensional materials. So these are like long, flat sheets, but they're only a single molecule thick. And it turns out that when you put ions in contact with these 2D materials, they're really good at controlling the location of those electron-like ghosts. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a 2D material, and here are some ions. And if I drift these ions close to the surface of the 2D material by applying an electric field, I can control where these ghost electrons go, how tightly they pack together, and now they just behave more like the electrons that we knew from before. And so we've used this technique to invent a bunch of different devices. I'm just going to show you one on this next slide. So this is a device where my group took the ion conducting material and we scaled that down to a single molecular layer. And then we stacked it with these other 2D sheet-like materials that are only a single molecular layer thick. And we made this really, really thin transistor. So this device not only has transistor-like characteristics, but it also has this memory effect, which means that when I turn the transistor on, it stays on. And then when I turn it off, it stays off. And that's all because of those ions. And so I do think ions make everything better. So what I've told you is that it was this outsider perspective. It was being willing to get outside of my comfort zone and bring the knowledge from the chemical sciences to bear in this different community that made the difference. And Lillian in the next talk is going to share with you a similar story. And it turns out that being an outsider can have many advantages. And if you look back, some of the very pioneers in this field were outsiders. So take, for example, Gordon Moore. He was the co-founder of Intel, the company that was largely responsible for all of this aggressive scaling of transistors that we have enjoyed for these past years. And Gordon Moore himself was trained as a chemist. Take Dr. Milligan Mason. She was an outsider just by virtue of the fact that she earned her PhD during a time in our history when very, very few women earned PhDs. She was an outsider who was willing to, with the support of her family, come into this field and make contributions. And it was her being an outsider that is the very reason we're here tonight celebrating. So my message is that the future belongs to the outsiders. Thank you.
Thank you. And so with that, we'd love to invite Dr. Hassau from North Carolina State